Good morning, good morning, good morning. Turn on the noise canceling, get the chat going, get the captions showing. Get the Instagram started up. All right, and we're rolling. Let's get started. All right, so we left off yesterday talking about Michele Sindona. This was the high up mobster in the Vatican slash financier. So this next section here is called the Shadow Game. Sindona purchased the Long Island Bank through Fosco AG, his holding company. He was represented by the New York law firm of Mudge, Rose, Guthrie, and Alexander, in which President Nixon and Attorney General John Mitchell had been partners. Sindona informed the Securities and Exchange Commission that he had raised $40 million for the deal by selling his shares in La Centrale, Credito Varicino, Pacetti, and Zetropo, major industrial and financial concerns, to Roberto Calvi, chairman of Banco Ambrosiano. So nothing suspicious there. Anybody who remembers the Banco Ambrosiano scandal is like the main reason we know about Operation Gladio. It was the main like mainstream scandal that was like public, that resulted in the discovery of the list of Propaganda Due P2 Lodge Masonic members who were all members of Operation Gladio, like high up administrators of the project. So to hear that he tells the Security Exchange Commissions flat out that, oh, I sold a bunch of shares in these other illicit fake banks that I own, so that I could make this other deal with this other corrupt and fake bank. Tish got his money. The Securities and Exchange Commission seemed satisfied, and the comptroller of the currency asked no questions. But nowhere can it be verified that Sindona received the $40 million from Calvi and Banco Ambrosiano, and nowhere can investigators find proof that Fosco transferred the money from any of its accounts. Love when that happens. As soon as the purchase was made, David M. Kennedy, Sindona's old partner, took a place on the board of Fosco AG and assumed responsibility for voting the shares at the annual board meeting of Franklin National. Kennedy, at that time, had left his position as President Nixon's Secretary of the Treasury to become the U.S. ambassador to NATO. One of the highest-ranking federal officials was a principal player in the new shadow game. So yeah, I love to be able to like make $40 million deals and then just never have to actually pay. You just get the thing and don't have to actually pay because you control or own all the people involved. Super fun. This next section here is bagging the broadcaster. When the deal was announced, Jack Bagon, a journalist for ABC in Italy, aired a report stating that concrete evidence had been established to show that Michele Sindona was involved in the heroin trade with American and Sicilian mafia families. I'm going to guess that this guy's going to die. He's going to be killed. This report should have raised enough suspicions for the U.S. regulatory agencies to disallow the transaction, but the purchase was approved without questions from any regulator. Several months after the broadcast, Bagon was contacted by Angelo Sorino, a Palermo police detective, who told him that he possessed documents concerning Sindona's ties not only to the mafia but also the CIA. Bagon arranged to meet Sorino on July 22, 1973. On the day of the meeting, Bagon was kidnapped from his office by two thugs. He appeared 2 months later in a clinic in Rome, exhausted and frightened. Bagon told the police he had been forced to fly to the United States and had been transported to several cities, including St. Louis, New Orleans, and Las Vegas, where he was grilled about the source of his story. Bagon said that he had pledged never to seek further information about Sindona or to, quote, follow up the story in any way. This was a pledge, the journalist said, that he intended to keep. Okay, so they literally kidnapped this guy, somehow transported him around. This makes the least sense out of all the intimidation tactics that I've heard so far. It's like if you have this journalist, so far every journalist or police detective or anybody who's like an operator who's not involved in Gladio who stumbles upon it, they just killed him. They literally just killed them. Sometimes their family too. The way that they did this is like literally puzzling. Like, why did they bring him to the U.S., move him all around, and then how did that somehow scare him enough to get him off of this case forever? It seemed like it would have been easier just to kill him, but let's read on. Thinking that Bagon's story was fishy, an Italian magistrate charged him for simulating a crime and ordered a full-scale investigation. Oh no. The authorities ultimately gathered enough evidence to support Bagon's story. Unfortunately, they were unable to question Angelo Sorino. The detective had been shot to death, mafia style, on a street in Palermo in January 1974. Okay, so they shot the detective, not the reporter. Weird. Just a very strange. It seems like it's also somewhat unorganized. Like they don't have strict methods, but they do have uh, methods that are excessive. They will use violence. They will be excessive, but not necessarily in the same way every time. I guess it's kind of funny. This next section here is unletter unanswered. It's probably a letter unanswered. A lot of typos in this book. The only questions came from Arthur Roth in an open letter dated July 18th, 1972, which he sent to the regulatory agencies and national newspapers, including the New York Times. Roth, who remained a minority Franklin shareholder, wrote the following to Lawrence Tish. The newspapers of July 13th, 1972 reported Lowe's Corp., of which you are its chief executive officer, a sale of sale of 1 million shares of stock of Franklin, New York Corporation for $40 million. The sale was to a company controlled by Michele Santona of Milan, Italy. Your sale of this stock raises some serious questions for the stockholders and depositors of the Franklin National Bank. Do you know enough about Michele Santona to unconditionally recommend him as a person who will be good for the bank? Will there be a full disclosure of his finances, his backers, and detailed biographies? Why would he pay $40 a share for stock that is currently selling for $32, having run up from $28 per share, apparently as a result of rumors of the sale? What are his intentions regarding additional purchases, and what role will he play in operation of the bank? Tish never responded to the letter. Neither did the regulatory agencies. Arthur F. Burns, chairman of the Federal Reserve, opted to turn a blind eye to the transaction, as did Peter G. Peterson, the Secretary of Commerce, and CIA Directors Richard Helms and James Schlesinger. All four men, along with Tish and David Kennedy, were prominent members of the Council on Foreign Relations. Okay. So you've got all these, these are some well-known. I'd never heard of Peter Peterson. That's an unfortunate name, but I had heard of Richard Helms and I've heard of James Schlesinger. Tish, obviously, we've mentioned before here in this book. David Kennedy, the same. So these are all just like high-level players in the early CIA and deep state. And of course, members, as they said, on the Council on Foreign Relations. So they're obviously going to work together in their anti-communist and fascist militia goals. This next section here is the Trilateral Commission, another notorious organization for this kind of stuff. If the situation was being manipulated by the CFR, the puppeteers most probably were the elite group within the organization who formed the Trilateral Commission in 1973. David Rockefeller became the chairman of the new commission, which openly sought to create a new world order controlled by multinational corporations and banks. So quite literally, though, the 90s far-right conspiracy bros were right in a way in that the globalists wanted to take control and create a new world order based on financialization and all of the things that allow them to have power over people. They just didn't do anything to stop that from happening because they were only focused on government. Let's see. So, which openly sought to create a new world order controlled by multinational corporations and banks. During Operation Condor, Rockefeller traveled throughout South America, telling the newly installed dictators how to run their governments. The effects of his visits south of the border were crystallized in Chile, where in 1976 the military regime under General Augusto Pinochet ignored international condemnation and the congressional cutoff of American aid due to its terrorist activities, thanks to $927 million in loans from Chase Manhattan, Citibank, Morgan Guarantee Trust, and other U.S. banks. Okay, so yeah, if the U.S. won't supply them with arms, the banks will. Keep that in mind if the U.S. ever does start to significantly cut off arms to Israel. See if any banks or other private interests step in to fill that void because it's in their interest to do so. The Trilateral Commission in effect, had made American bankers a higher authority than the elected representatives of the American people. Yeah, as if that wasn't already the case, but I guess now it's finally codified in the late 70s. This next section here is the financial nightmare. In keeping with Gladio's game plan, Sandona's purchase of Franklin National created a financial nightmare. By April 1974, less than 2 years after the acquisition, the bank was in a tailspin, announcing a net operating income of 2 cents a share for the first quarter, compared to the previous year's 68 cents a share. But even this report had been falsified. The reality was that Franklin had suffered a $40 million loss and the bleeding still needed to be clamped. By August, the Federal Reserve, knowing that Franklin was on the brink of collapse, granted the ailing institution unlimited access to federal funds. One of the most bewildering questions in the sordid saga of Franklin National remains the rationale behind the Federal Reserve's decision to shell out hundreds of millions to the Sindona Bank. I mean, I guess it seems like a mystery on the face of it if you don't know who all the players are, who all the people involved are, and like how they're connected, but sure, let's pretend it's a mystery. Surely, the Fed officials knew that the bank could not survive. Warning notices about Franklin's terminal condition had been issued by Morgan Guarantee Trust and a host of other international financial institutions. But the money kept pouring into Franklin until the Long Island Bank finally collapsed on October 8, 1974. By that time, the Fed had shelled out $2 billion to Franklin without any hope of recovery. Remember, this is all stuff that you guys are paying for. You pay taxes, you pay for these bank bailouts that go absolutely nowhere, and you end up getting none of that back. It was the largest bank failure in American history at that time, and the first since the Great Depression. This next section here is the fall guys. In 1975, Peter Shattuck, the former executive vice chairman of the bank's international division, pled guilty to fraud. He was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment and fined $20,000. Following their 1979 trial in the Federal District Court of New York, Paul Luftig, the bank's former president and the chief administrative officer, and J. Michael Carter, a former senior vice president, were convicted of falsifying financial records. They ended up serving a year at the Allen Wood Federal Prison Camp in Pennsylvania, but no charges were raised against David M. Kennedy, who remained the pivotal player in the plot. Kennedy's complicity in the crime was not only evidenced by his position as a director of Fasco AG, but also his voting control over the controlling shares owned by Sindona. The scam probably could not have been undertaken without his cooperation. Kennedy was well connected to Arthur F. Burns, the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Both Kennedy and Burns were key appointees of the Nixon administration, and both were prominent members of the CFR and the Trilateral Commission. Kennedy was also closely tied to James E. Smith, the comptroller of the currency, who neglected to conduct the legally mandated inspections of Franklin after Sindona acquired it, and approved Franklin's overseas expansion even when the bank was in dire straits. For many years, Smith had served as Kennedy's undersecretary of the Treasury. So yeah, once again, just like outlining all these very obvious connections that these bad actors have, exactly what their motives are, why they're doing things that make no legal or financial sense, but they keep doing them anyway, and also why there seems to be no pushback from the populace who has to pay and foot the bill for all these things. They just don't know or care. This next section here is the Banca Privata collapse. Throughout 1974, the crack within the Sindona overseas operations continued to widen into a cleft. Having raided the assets of Banca Privata Finanziaria and Banca Unione, Italy's national union bank, which he purchased with the Vatican in 1970, Sindona merged the two firms into a new financial institution called Banca Privata. The two large holes now became a massive crater. That even the most myopic bank examiner in Milan could not ignore. Okay. So it basically depends on all of the regulators and investigators who would normally clamp down on this kind of thing. It counts on them either not knowing that this is happening or just not caring enough, or knowing but then understanding that if they were to go after these people or try to prosecute them, regulate them in any way, that they would just be killed. So I guess just keep that in mind when you're thinking about why all these regulators and banking people just allowed this shady shit to happen. It's kind of funny. So by July 1974, Sindona's new institution displayed a loss of 200 billion lira. Somehow, Sindona managed to convince the directors of Banca di Roma to sink $200 million into Banca Privata. The Sicilian obviously possessed a silver tongue because even a second-rate accountant would have been aware that Sindona's financial empire was about to tumble. The ill-advised loan, no doubt, was due to his position in the Vatican and his powerful American associates. By September 1974, less than 3 months after its creation, Banca Privata went into compulsory liquidation with losses over $300 million, causing Banca di Roma to teeter on the brink of bankruptcy. So this bank is so insolvent, it's taking other banks down with it. What's that old saying? Like, if you owe the bank $1 million, or if you owe the bank, I guess $1 million, it's their problem. If you owe them $1 billion, it's your problem. But then if you owe them $1 billion, it's their problem. Basically, just outlining how you can flip the tables on who has the power in the situation if you get them to over leverage themselves. And it seems like that's exactly what they did here. Kind of also similar to like when the banks were giving out fraudulent or just bad loans to people who couldn't pay them back during the 2008 financial crisis. It's like if you were incentivized by the system to make bad decisions, you can topple that whole system, or you can force the government to step in and bail you out to such a degree that it props up the entire thing. So continuing here, the loss to the Holy Mother Church, according to Swiss estimates, was in the range of $1 billion, but such estimates failed to take into account the massive accounts of drug money flowing into the Vatican's coffers from the drug trade. Nor did they realize that the massive disappearance of funds was necessary to further the strategy of tension and the cause of Gladio. After the collapse of Banco Privata and Franklin National, the sound of Sindona's failing financial institutions reverberated throughout Europe. In a matter of weeks, Bankhaus Wolf of Hamburg, Bankhaus Herstadt of Cologne, and Amancourt Bank of Zurich lay in financial ruins. Untold billions fell through a massive crater that became known in the Italian press as Il Crack Sindona. So yeah, this guy is like purposely, or not purposely, but effectively taking down several different financial institutions in different countries because his bank is a black hole. This next section here is the Midnight Call. About 4 more minutes on this one. I'll switch to the next book. So the Midnight Call. Shortly after the stroke of midnight on October 4th, 1974, Licio Gelli made a call to Sindona, who was staying at a chalet in Switzerland, to inform him that the Italian government was preparing 2 warrants for his arrest, one for a false 1971 balance sheet and the other for filing a fraudulent statement of bankruptcy. Quote, "Leave Switzerland before they notify Interpol," Gelli said. "Get out of there so that they can't extradite you. If you don't, our enemies will torture you. They may even kill you. It is very dangerous, Michele. Things have changed." Things indeed had changed. Throughout Europe, prominent bankers had lost a fortune, thanks to Sindona's financial shenanigans, and were now demanding the arrest of the, quote, Pope's banker. Sindona heeded Gelli's advice. He packed his bags and headed back to New York, where he could remain under the protection of the mafia and the CIA within his luxurious suite in the discreetly elegant Hotel Pierre on Fifth Avenue. So yeah, that's another thing to keep in mind. It's like, of course, since these people are throwing around massive amounts of money, you have to always remember that they're living a lifestyle similar to like Jeffrey Epstein or Kissinger or any of those other like dastardly evil people who do nothing but manipulate others, hurt people for a living, and scheme. They also get to live high on the hog while they're doing this. They get to live in like the nicest places, eat the best meals, do whatever the fuck they want. So this next section here is the good life. Life was good in the Big Apple. Sindona's daughter, son-in-law, and 2 granddaughters moved in with him. Every night they dined at the Café Pierre on the ground floor of the Hotel Pierre, where chefs prepared special dishes for the honored guest. Sindona became the financial consultant for Johnny Gambino's G&G, Gambino and Genovese Concrete Company. He also became a lecturer in economics at many leading American universities. At the University of Pennsylvania, Sindona waved the American flag and spoke as a democratic idealist. He began his address by saying, quote, "The aim, perhaps an ambitious one, of this brief talk is to contribute to restoring the faith of the United States in its economic, financial, and monetary sectors, and to remind it that the free world needs America." At Columbia University, several days after he was sentenced in absentia by a Milan court to 3.5 years in prison for embezzlement, Sindona upheld the importance of high morals and fiscal accountability by saying, quote, "When payments are made with the intent of evading the law in order to obtain unfair benefits, a public reaction is clearly called for. Both the corrupted and the corrupter should be punished." So yeah, great that these people are just like acting as like these moral arbiters of what should go on in the financial institutions while they're quite literally being sentenced for embezzlement. While this dude's quite literally running an empire of drug trafficking and Nazi shit. St. Peter's denial is this next section here. Sindona may have been an honored guest at Ivy League institutions and private social clubs in Little Italy, but the bronze doors to the Holy See were closed to him. As Italian investigators uncovered the Vatican's ties to Banco Privata, Pope Paul VI became an object of scorn and derision. Stories appeared in the press claiming the Holy Father had lost up to $1 billion because of his clandestine deals with Sindona. On the left of the theological spectrum, the Jesuits attacked the Pope for his interference in Italian politics and, quote, the placement of the Church's future in the hands of the devil. On the right, Tridentine conservatives, including French Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, demanded Paul VI's abdication. The Traditionalist, a Catholic weekly newspaper, after publishing a detailed account of the Sindona affair in February 1975, called the Pope, quote, a traitor to the Church. Archbishop Marcinkus was forced to submit to the indignity of intensive questioning by Italian officials about his transactions with Sindona on a personal basis and as a representative of the Vatican. The Archbishop performed as expected. In April 1973, he had told U.S. investigators, quote, Michele and I are very good friends. We've known each other for many years. 2 years later, when questioned by the Italian magazine L'Espresso, Marcinkus said, quote, the truth is that I don't know Sindona. How can I have lost money because of him? Sindona was shut off not only from Marcinkus and the Holy Father, but also from Roberto Calvi, the new Direttore Generale of Banco Ambrosiano in Milan, who refused to receive his telephone calls. What's more, Calvi and Marcinkus advanced Sindona's scheme of raiding the assets of Milan Bank by setting up a string of shell companies as unofficial subsidiaries of the Roman Catholic Church in Panama and the Bahamas. These companies began to receive massive loans from Banco Ambrosiano in Milan and Banco Ambrosiano Holding in Luxembourg. Such investments seemed secure, since the church was the rock against which, quote, the gates of hell could not prevail. As an added insult to their former mentor, Calvi and Marcinkus removed Sindona's name as a director of Cisalpine, the Nassau Financial Front, which now became known as Banco Ambrosiano overseas. Okay, so they just basically cut him out of all this stuff. He got burned. That's like his burn notice. They're telling him, you're out. We can't deal with you anymore. You're too publicly corrupt. You're too well known. Kind of odd how you can just like flip that way. Because obviously this guy was not like an unknown person. He was highly connected, well known in the finance and government circles. So you got too sloppy, kid. So this next section here is the purple funk. Pope Paul VI fell into a purple funk. That's weird. Why is it purple? His behavior became erratic. He spoke with his confidants about the possibility of resigning. Before he would agree to set aside his tiara, the Pope said that he would have to make amends for the financial loss he had caused the Holy Mother Church. He wished to retain the right to name his successor, and he requested the abolition of the 400-year-old decree that prohibited popes from selling their sanctified positions as vicars of Christ to the highest bidders amongst the College of Cardinals. Okay, so I guess he's trying to like literally sell his seat. This return to the time-honored practice of simony would permit Paul VI to raise a fortune for the church. The fortune he had lost thanks to his dealings with Sindona and the mafia. The Holy Father complained of lack of sleep. He wandered through the corridors of the papal apartments in the Apostolic Palace in the wee small hours of the morning, often complaining to guards and attendants of an ominous presence within the Holy See. Quote, the smoke of Satan has entered the church, he said. It is all around the altar. I wonder if, is this the one that they say that he is supposedly assassinated by Gladio operatives? I guess we'll find out. I'll read a little more here. How much time do I got? Oh, no, wait. I'm way over time. Sorry, you guys. I'm at 23 minutes already. What's up there, Shibbles? Shibbles says, completely out of touch with reality, all because they hoard wealth. Yeah, that really is what it's like. All right, so then I will pick up tomorrow on this book. We'll talk about the extradition hearing is the next section. But if I remember correctly, I'm pretty sure Pope Paul VI like dies while he's in what's the word office, while he's in his tenure as Pope. And I thought it was like suspected that the CIA or some kind of intelligence agency had an involvement or caused that. But we shall see. We'll check it out tomorrow. All right, so picking back up on the Western Marxism book, we had talked yesterday about Bloch, Horkheimer, Adorno, and some of these other Western Marxists who made all these excuses for why Eastern Marxism was somehow just as bad as fascism, and that the Western versions of Marxism, which were purely academic and performative and not any kind of militant exercise, are purer forms of Marxism and not just fascism adjacent. So picking back up here. The assumption had been in the terrible memory of the final solution. The assumption had behind it the terrible memory of the final solution. Yet not only was it not demonstrated to be true, its meaning was not even made clear or precise. Historically, the annihilation of a state or a country has not been a rare phenomenon. One thinks of Poland at the end of the 18th century divided between Russia, Austria, and Prussia, of the states or statelets absorbed into a larger entity in the course of the national unification process in Italy or Germany, or of the disappearance of the Confederate States of America at the end of the American Civil War, of the dissolving of the Soviet Union, or the evil empire in the words of its implacable foe Ronald Reagan. Or one thinks of the transformation of the old South Africa, founded on white supremacy, into a completely new South Africa. In all these cases, the political annihilation of a state, however arbitrary and unjust it may be, did not bring about the physical annihilation of its inhabitants. Marcuse flew above all this. His certainty, however, was fragile. On the left, this is a quote from him, on the left in the United States, there is a quite strong and entirely understandable tendency to identify with Israel. On the other hand, the left, particularly the Marxist left, cannot pretend to ignore that the Arab world coincides in part with the anti-imperialist camp. In this case, emotional and conceptual solidarity are objectively separate, indeed, even split. So I was going to then pause and ask, what the fuck does he mean by that? But as I can see, this next paragraph addresses exactly that. Why does, quote, emotional solidarity win out over, quote, conceptual solidarity? At least for a philosopher, it should be the opposite. Marcuse justifies himself by recourse to his Jewish ancestry, quote, you understand how I feel solidarity with, and I identify with Israel for very personal and not only personal reasons. But wasn't letting oneself give into, quote, emotional solidarity from national and ethnic connections the viewpoint of German social democracy of the era of Wilhelm II? And so, June 1967 was the August 4th of critical theory and the concrete utopia, and in fact of Marcuse himself. So yeah, that's basically what all of the logical leaps that liberals make is like, well, I know that this is wrong in principle and by every, tenet that I've purported to be like my guiding principles here, but I'm still going to go against that in this one particular instance because I have some kind of personal investment in it. So you have Marcuse, who's Jewish, saying, well, look, I got to side with Zionism. I'm Jewish. Got to go back into the Bible and historical record to justify my murderous colonial empire here. Section 12, 1968, and the mass equivocation of Western Marxism. During the 1960s and 70s, mass equivocation characterized the Marxist left in Europe and the United States. The great demonstrations in favor of Vietnam connected happily with the homage paid to Adorno and Horkheimer, who considered the movements of national liberation backward and reactionary, and who watched from a distance, or, in the case of the latter, did not fail to support the war the United States unleashed in Vietnam. In those years, together with Vietnam, China also enjoyed mass support. But we find here another comedy of equivocation, and not only because the People's Republic, born of a centuries-old struggle for national and anti-colonial liberation, aspired to put itself at the head of the movements of national and anti-colonial liberation disdained by critical theory. There is another reason. In 1966, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution. In Italy, the communist daily Il Manifesto saluted him in its first issue, April 18, 1971, with an article by K.S. Carroll that expressed pleasure that, quote, during the Cultural Revolution, the party and state apparatuses were strongly reduced. It was the start of the realization of utopia and the beginning of the withering away of the state. In reality, Mao had publicly distanced himself from the ideal some years before in exercising power on a national scale. By now, it was clear that, quote, the organs of our state would endure indefinitely. Quote, let's take the courts. We'll still need courts 10,000 years from now, even after the elimination of classes. The contradictions, even if no longer antagonistic, will have continued and survived under communism and require a juridical and state order to regulate them. Regarding the Cultural Revolution in 1969, on the occasion of the 9th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, Lin Biao, at that time the designated heir to Mao Zedong, had made the objectives pursued by the leaders of Beijing unequivocally clear. Quote, as the 16-point decision indicates, the great proletarian cultural revolution is a powerful force for developing the social productive forces in our country. Our country has seen good harvests in agricultural production for years running, and there is also a thriving situation in industrial production and science and technology. The enthusiasm of the broad masses and of the working people, both in revolution and production, has soared to unprecedented heights. Many factories, mines, and other enterprises have time and again topped their production records, creating all-time highs of production. The technical revolution is making constant progress. Grasp revolution, promote production. This principle is absolutely correct. This was a point that Lin Biao insisted on forcefully. Another quote: "We must firmly grasp revolution and energetically promote production and fulfill and overfulfill our plans for developing the national economy. It is certain that the great victory in the great proletarian cultural revolution will continue to bring about new leaps forward on the economic front and in our cause of socialist construction as a whole." Not by accident, one of the principal indictments made against the deposed president of the People's Republic of China, Liu Shaoqi, was, quote, "the doctrine of trailing behind at a snail's pace," namely incomprehension of the fact that the Cultural Revolution would, in the eyes of its advocates, accelerate prodigiously the development of the productive forces, bringing the country rapidly up to the level of more advanced capitalist countries. The Cultural Revolution relaunched the Great Leap Forward that had been going on since 1958, through which China adventurously hoped to make record time in economic and industrial development, thanks to the mass mobilization and enthusiasm for work and production. What did Western Marxism understand of all this? In Italy, the same people enthusiastic over the new course adopted by Beijing also welcomed the book whose central thesis was that the socialist revolution, quote, "would suppress work, and in so doing, it would abolish class domination. Suppression of work by the working class and the violent destruction of capital are one and the same." So it's interesting. I wonder like what people actually thought was going to become of the Cultural Revolution. If they thought that like you could somehow make a society where people work less, fewer hours, or have some kind of more democratic control over that work, and then still also not only compete with, but then exceed past the competing nations that are capitalist in nature. And it seems like people are trying to deal with that contradiction uh, in various ways. Like obviously, people in the West always make this, like we've talked about here, this disingenuous and kind of fake criticism that like socialism isn't being conducted ideally well enough in other countries, while again they live on the backs of the people who are being colonized by their not socialist system. Sorry, I gotta block this spot here. Western Marxism equals psyop. Yeah, thank you, Shibbles. I agree. uh, there's no audio. What do you mean? There's definitely audio. All right, so at this point, the comedy of equivocations reached its culmination. Already in 1937, in the essay, quote, "On Practice," Mao had made clear the centrality of, quote, "activity in material production, to the growth not only of social wealth, but also, quote, "of human consciousness." Indeed, quote, "the small scale of production limited man's outlook." Thanks to its pedagogical function, activity in material production was not destined to disappear, even in, quote, "the classless society." In the West, instead, celebrating the leader of the Chinese Revolution could be connected to the expectation of the end of work. The essay, quote, "On Practice," was cited often, but only to discuss the class struggle, removing both the struggle for production and the struggle for scientific experimentation. With the principal slogan launched by the Cultural Revolution, quote, "Make revolution, increase production," Western Marxism forgot Mao's thought, to which it had paid homage. Moreover, the slogan, quote, "Worker suppression of work," also broke with Marx and the post-capitalist scenario he had sketched. According to the Communist Manifesto, quote, "the proletariat will use its political supremacy and control of the means of production to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible." These general theses assumed a particular importance in the East. After shaking off the colonial yoke, the countries and peoples of the newly independent states were committed to consolidating this independence economically. They did not want to depend on their ex-masters' alms and arbitrary will. They considered it essential to break the monopoly that the most powerful countries held, and in part, to a declining degree, they still hold over the most advanced technology. Mao, who in 1949 had already sought to guard against the danger for the Chinese People's Republic of economically, quote, "becoming an American colony," felt a strong commitment to abolish two types of inequality: that existing inside of China, but also, and perhaps even more so, that which separated China from the more advanced countries. Powerfully accelerating the development of the productive forces, overcoming the former contradiction, would have facilitated the overcoming of the latter. In this way, the Chinese nation would rise steadily, and the long struggle for recognition made necessary by oppression and the humiliation imposed by imperialism would be crowned with complete success. Thanks to a political revolution to promote equality both domestically and internationally, and thanks at the time to the powerful development of the productive forces, the Asian country would become an irresistible model for the world anti-colonialist revolution and for building socialism. It's so funny because we're saying this now, talking about like the 60s, 70s, um, and it's like that seemed to have been the plan all along, was to increase the productive forces, show other countries how you can actually build socialism in the real world while without falling to reaction because you're too weak, and then provide that model. And that's quite literally what they have done. And it's only capitalists in the West who pretend that like Deng Xiaoping and all the people that followed weren't part of and following that exact plan when it's exactly what they were doing. The Vietnamese communists expressed a similar view. While completely immersed in the war for independence and national unity, the then first secretary of the Workers' Party of North Vietnam declared that once power had been achieved, the most important task would be, quote, the technical revolution. Starting from that moment, it was, quote, the productive forces that played the decisive role. It was therefore a matter of working hard to, quote, achieve a higher level of productivity, stimulating the construction of the economy and the development of production. Of the great conflicts going on in Asia and throughout the Third World, Western Marxism perceived only one aspect, that of the revolt against capitalism more than against imperialism. Scarce attention was reserved for the struggles for national liberation, and above all, that of the revolt against power as such. It was in this sense that the West read the slogan, quote, "It is right to rebel," with which Mao sought to rid himself of the adversaries who still occupied important positions of power in the Communist Party. If in China rebellion was invoked to free the enthusiastic commitment of the masses at work and in the development of social wealth, in the West, rebellion against power as such made impossible the building of an alternative social order and reduced Marxism to an impotent critical theory, or, in the best of hypotheses, to messianic expectations. Damn, that is like just out of nowhere, like a fire quote right there. It's like that is quite literally diagnosing exactly the problem with Western Marxism. It's messianic. They wait for heroes. They do nothing, and they rebel against all forms of power. As such, just power is bad, and it's literally like the ContraPoints quote. Like they don't want power. They want to endlessly criticize power, and it's just funny because she doesn't realize she is embodying that exact quote while saying it. Anarchy was the objective and unforeseen result of the Cultural Revolution, remedied by the Army's intervention. In the West, instead, the appeal to rebellion against power as such in society and work served to reboot anarchism theoretically as well. Defeated with effort by Marxism during the Second International, anarchism was to see a spectacular revenge in the movement of 1968 and in important sectors of Western Marxism in those years. Yeah, it's always the anarchism. It's always like the anarchist poison pill that ruins social movements and makes sure that they are totally impotent, non threatening, and they go absolutely nowhere. And that's literally the problem with the Western left is like they can never just look at an actual socialist movement, learn from it, adapt it to their conditions. They always have to, in that process, insert their failure ideology and their stupid ideas of individualist bullshit into it until it's ruined, until it gets watered down to be totally ineffective. And these don't even necessarily have to be feds doing this. This is literally just what Western leftists actually believe and actually feel the need to insert into every situation because they don't know anything different and they won't read. So, chapter 13 here, Sartre's populist and idealist anti-colonialism. Even authors strongly committed to the struggle against colonialism could not resist it. Let's take Jean-Paul Sartre. As is made clear in a key chapter of the Critique of Dialectical Reason, various human conflicts ultimately derive from scarcity, or rarity, to which a decisive role is attributed. Quote, scarcity, whatever form it takes, dominates all praxis. In reciprocity modified by scarcity, the same person appears to us as the counterhuman insofar as the same person appears to us as radically other, i.e., the bearer of a death threat to us. The result of this assumption is devastating. To the extent that it appears to make a struggle of life and death necessary, the condition of scarcity ends up justifying the oppressors themselves, who are in some fashion also victims of a tragic struggle for survival that in the present imposes itself and which in the future could be eliminated only by the development of the productive forces. On the opposite side, the oppressors appear moved first and foremost, or even exclusively, by the desire to escape from the intolerable conditions of life. But then, given that language, culture, identity, and national dignity play no role in this situation. It becomes impossible for the part of the social strata that enjoys a comfortable life or more or less considerable ease to understand participation in struggles against national oppression. The Wretched of the Earth by the Algerian revolutionary Fanon refutes Sartre. The French philosopher contributed a passionate preface to Fanon's book. Quote, Today we know that in the first phase of the national struggle, colonialism tries to disarm national demands by putting forward economic doctrines. As soon as the first demands are set out, colonialism pretends to consider them, recognizing with ostentatious humility that the territory suffers from serious underdevelopment, which necessitates a great economic and social effort. The rejection of quote, economic doctrines is, in fact, the critique of the thesis that would make the colonial question derive exclusively from scarcity. In Sartre himself, there was a contradiction. If the critique of dialectical reason relies on quote, scarcity in the preface to The Wretched of the Earth, the heavy lifting is done by the paradigm of recognition. The quote, enemies of mankind obstinately deny recognition to quote, the race of less than humans, such as the Algerians and the colonial peoples in general. As we see, indignation over the crimes of colonialism and empathy and solidarity with the colonial peoples in their struggle against oppression did not guarantee an adequate understanding of the national question. For Sartre, the protagonists of the anti-colonial revolution were always, quote, the wretched of the earth, engaged in a desperate struggle to liberate themselves from colonial domination. Missing, however, was any reference to the second stage of the anti-colonial revolution, which focused on economic construction. Fanon insisted forcefully on this. Uh, To make concrete and solid the independence won thanks to the armed struggle, the newly independent country must leave behind underdevelopment. The commitment to work and production thus took the place of courage in battle. The figure of the more or less skilled worker took over from that of the guerrilla fighter. When it is forced to surrender, the colonial power seems to say to the revolutionaries, quote, since you want independence, take it and starve. And so, in this way, quote, the apotheosis of independence is transformed into the curse of independence. The new challenge of a non-military character required knowing how to reply. Quote, now to do all this, other things are needed over and above human output. Capital of all kinds, technicians, engineers, skilled merchants, and so on. What was needed was a, quote, gigantic effort by an entire people. Mm-hmm. Yep. Let me just check the chat here. Shibble says, on practice should be changed to on do. That's very funny. He also says, Trotsky and his whole permanent revolution was just the inferior person, quote, waiting on love. Yeah, I mean, it was quite literally it's like a psychological deviation from Marxism based on like feelings, based on like personal interests. It's not based on principle. The impasse in many African countries that failed to move from the military phase to the economic phase of the revolution was somewhat to be expected. On the other hand, this turning point was achieved by anti-colonial revolutions such as the Chinese, Vietnamese, and Algerian. We are in 1961. In that year, another eminent theoretician of the anti-colonialist revolution dedicated a book to Toussaint Louverture that was also a summing up of the revolution, of which the great Black Jacobin was a central protagonist. After the military victory, he posed the problem of economic construction. To this end, he fostered a culture of work and productivity and even sought to utilize white technicians and experts from the defeated enemy. This was exactly what Lenin would do in the years of the NEP, introducing into workplaces the end of, quote, indolence and, quote, the most rigorous discipline, and turning to, quote, bourgeois specialists. It is a point that was difficult for Sartre to understand and accept. The theory of revolution formulated in the, quote, critique of dialectical reason expressed disappointment that the, quote, fused group, the protagonist of the overthrow and the ancien regime, filled with revolutionary enthusiasm, tends to transform itself after the assumption of power into a, quote, practico-inert structure with new hierarchies that take the place of those overthrown. But it is not the fused group that can achieve economic and technological development in a newly independent country. An anti-colonial revolution, or one in a country at the margins of the more advanced capitalist world and therefore exposed to the dangers of aggression and colonial or neo-colonial subjection, is truly victorious only if it can boost economic construction. Given Sartre's philosophical assumptions, he showed little interest in understanding this problem. The pathos of the subject, quote, our point of departure is indeed the subjectivity of the individual, and the polemic against, quote, the myth of objectivity flowed from a subjective idealism. Quote, what is needed is, in a word, a philosophical theory that shows human reality is action, and that action upon the universe is identical with the understanding of the universe as it is. Or, in other words, that action is the unmasking of reality, and at the same time a modification of that reality. We are led to think of Fichte, for whom the French Revolution found its theoretical expression in the philosophy of Fichte himself, which liberated the subject, quote, from the constraints of things in themselves, from external influences, and in the final analysis, from material objectivity. It is a vision that can perhaps stimulate the overthrow of the ancien regime of colonial domination, but that is of little help as soon as economic construction, necessary for establishing real independence, is called upon to take account of material objectivity with, quote, things in themselves. So yeah, I guess there's a lot of ways of saying that, like, we have theoretical problems transitioning from overthrowing the previous capitalist regime to then shifting over your focus to building the new regime that is not capitalist in nature, but then also competes with the capitalists, defends against the capitalists. These are the contradictions that we're dealing with here, folks. And you can watch, like, that's so much of what Marxism is studying the various different revolutionary projects that got to that point and then either succeeded or failed depending on the decisions that they made. We have seen Sartre stress, quote, action as an instrument for understanding and transforming political reality. The action he speaks of is exclusively political. Quite different is the argument of the leaders of the anti-colonial revolution. In 1937, Mao Zedong insisted that the truth comes not from solitary speculation, but quote, from the process of social practice. But Mao quickly added that beyond the, quote, class struggle or political action, quote, material production and, quote, scientific experimentation were both integral parts of, quote, social practice. Engaged in governing the liberated areas during the anti-colonial revolution, the Chinese leader could certainly not ignore the challenge of material objectivity inherent in fulfilling the unavoidable task of economic and technological development. Concentrating his attention only on the desperate efforts of the, quote, wretched of the earth to break the chains of their colonial enslavement, and reserving his empathy exclusively for the fused group, the subject of a magical but brief moment of the revolution, that of the collective enthusiasm that accompanies the overthrow of a universally hated ancien regime. Sartre championed an anti-colonialism that was passionate and praiseworthy, but that remained populist and idealist. It was an anti-colonialism that could not understand the phases of the revolution involving the construction of a new order. So, as Fanon explained, technical competence became the slogan of the day. To cite the Algerian revolutionary again, the, quote, grandiose effort of an entire people is needed, or to use this time Césaire's phrase, the end of, quote, indolence and the most rigorous discipline at work. So yeah, he's bringing up Aimé Césaire here. So it's like Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, who's the other one? Amilcar Cabral. There's other, like, all these anti-colonial, like, Walter Rodney is a good one. All these thinkers who, like, it's not a coincidence that so many of them are people of color and actually come from these colonized countries. And then you have these people who are like these Western, French, English, German philosophers who are like, actually, the way we're doing it is better. The way you brown people are doing it is not the right way. You guys are being too violent. You guys are being too capitalist. You guys are doing, like, they have all these technical idealist criticisms, but they don't actually build socialism in the West on their own. I feel like a broken record saying all this stuff, but like, it really is just the same thing over and over and over and over again. All right, I got one more minute on this one, but since I went long from the other, I'll read just a little bit more here. So section 14, Timpanaro, Anti-Colonialism and Anarchism. Sebastiano Timpanaro also demonstrates an understanding of the colonial question, and he harshly criticizes the Marxism developed in the capitalist metropoles for being incapable of seeing beyond itself. Between the 19th and 20th centuries, quote, the Marxism of the Second International was in the grips of a, quote, schematic and tenaciously Eurocentric philosophy of history that paid little attention to the, quote, militarist and reactionary adventures of the bourgeoisie and the, quote, imperialist phase of capitalism. Damn. I was like, why have I never heard of this Sebastiano Timpanaro guy? My first inclination is to say we have not heard of him very much because he actually has the correct line. So the Western Marxists had to like just shut him up, basically. Was there a turning point with the October Revolution? Unfortunately, only a partial one. Eurocentrism and the scarce attention paid to the tragedies inflicted by Europe and the West on the colonial peoples were anything but transcended by, quote, Western Marxism, which was inclined to anti Leninism. It was a ruinous tendency, both theoretically and politically, and it became accentuated, although necessarily so, in 1956. Quote, de-Stalinization, because of the confused way in which it was prosecuted and the potentially social democratic character which it all too soon acquired, led to a reflorescence of, quote, westernizing tendencies. But as with Sartre, even in the case of his Italian philologist philosopher, though in a different way, we find a mismatch between the political platform and the theoretical categories. It is true, referring to Lenin, that Timpanaro recognized, quote, the continued existence of national questions, which were legitimate given the oppression by imperialism, and that he unhesitatingly supported the struggle of the Vietnamese people against U.S. imperialism. However, he cast a heavy shadow of suspicion on national liberation movements when they assimilated, quote, racial hatreds and national conflicts. Indeed, the individual, quote, may feel, because of mystifying ideologies, national, religious, or racial solidarity above class solidarity. But it is precisely in each case mystifying ideologies that seek to conceal the inconsistency of race and nation as biological cultural categories. We have seen that an oppressed people's desire for national redemption can be well combined with a universalistic pathos that puts into question the arrogance and the racist intrigues that the colonial powers exemplified. Timpanaro's impassioned anti-colonialist commitment contradicts his theoretical platform on many levels. He takes the Marxist thesis of the withering away of the state and further radicalizes it with an explicit reference to the anarchism of Bakunin. Already unrealistic, the expectation of the vanishing of every norm directly contradicts with the military struggle or the economic one in the building or defense of independent national states. Okay, so we can see Timpanaro did not take the correct line. He just, I guess, took a slightly better line, but then deviates to anarchism a little later than the rest, but still ends up doing that. It's like it is the death knell of all Western Marxist ideologies. The urgency of economic and technological development, an unavoidable precondition for real independence, brings about, in China, Vietnam, and Cuba, an opening to the market and concessions to the national bourgeoisie, whose entrepreneurial and managerial competence is needed, and the international bourgeoisie, whose assent is needed for access to the most advanced technology. Yet Timpanaro formulated a critical judgment on the policies that in Soviet Russia ended so-called war communism. Quote, the NEP, in Lenin's intention, was to be only a transitory, quote, catching of breath, whereas after his death it became an enduring reality. Together with the nation and the state, the philologist philosopher seemed to dream of the withering away of the market, a messianic and anarchist vision of post-capitalist society. Yeah, that's a very good call out right there. People think of the withering away of the state as also of the withering away of the market, as if you just do socialism in one country and that somehow changes the entire world that you live in and allows you to operate differently. It's almost like it's a utopian, idealist, and unrealistic vision of how these things work. All right, so I'm bookmarking this one here. Now let's switch over to The Soviets Expected It by Louise Strong. I gotta make this one bigger here, sorry. So we left off on the section, I believe it was called Russians Are People. It's just funny to have to even say it that way, but that is a very good call out for the Russophobia that is so common in the West. It's like, just even think of them as people the way we are. People always think of Russians as like some kind of other thing. People call them orcs here, and they act like they're the progressive. They are very young in the first place, younger probably than the dominant people in any other land of today. Half of the Soviet population is under 21. In this, they resemble the America of 50 years ago, but not of today. Perhaps they resemble still more the America of the Jacksonian era, boiling with democratic energies, when we attacked the wilderness. The population's youth is partly due, as it was in that early America, to the hardships of war and hunger, which shortened the life of the older folk in previous years. It is due still more to the high birth rate, which, combined with a falling death rate, makes the natural increase of population probably greater in the Soviet Union than in any other land. Anyone who has lived in the USSR knows that the young women all have jobs and they all marry young, There are practically no old maids in the land. Family life is simple and wholesome, and babies are taken as a pleasure and a matter of course. The babies themselves are far less nervous and high strung than ours are. We had 3 at one time staying in my Moscow flat, my visiting stepdaughters, my secretaries, and my housemates. All of them together seemed to cause less commotion than one would in a New York apartment. The custom of the country takes babies easily, as pioneer and vital people do. This young population is very active physically, mentally, and in government tasks. They are self reliant. It is a quality that starts young. Soviet schools encourage pupils to express their special tastes in both school and vacation activities. They are encouraged to develop special talents. Their universities have nearly twice as many hours of classroom work as our American colleges and would stand a as oh sorry and would stand. A youth I know was attending classes and laboratory work 7 hours a day, 6 days a week. Okay, as our American colleges would stand. So basically, they were doing way more work than anybody in the American colleges would be able to tolerate. The people travel far more than Europeans and possibly more than Americans. They certainly travel in far more uncomfortable ways. Their railways handle twice the passenger miles that American railways do, yet with only half as many locomotives. That makes them 4 times as crowded. Soviet people of all ages will take 10-day trips to new jobs or to vacation resorts without a thought, sleeping on hard boards all the way. They are hardy. It is a quality that has survival value in war. I once met 20 young, quote, Arctic explorers, about 15 years of age. They were going to the polar regions for a summer outing on a Murmansk train. Their energetic study of maps, northern peoples, and Arctic cruises, carried on in different schools, had won from their teachers a recommendation to the organized cruise. A real Arctic explorer led their expedition, and they expected to meet other Arctic explorers in the north who would take the kids seriously and tell them what polar exploring was all about. The highest authorities in the country are often called upon to explain things to children. 10 of the best pupils in botany, aged 14 to 15, made a similar expedition that summer to the Altai Mountains at government expense. They hiked well over 1,000 miles and discovered 27 new varieties of black currants, which they sent with great pride to the aged Maturin, the famous plant creator, the Burbank of Russia. So they have like an entirely different system. They're taking kids more seriously than American culture was. People are traveling more. I think it's really cool just to show all these differences in Soviet culture and the Western cultures, because of course, like the Westerners just assume that all of this stuff is very bleak, that there's like not a lot of amenities, that people are just like suffering all the time. Obviously, we all know the stereotypes about what people thought of like Soviet life, that they just ate potatoes and starved and went to jail all the time. But to see that they actually had like a fantastic lifestyle, it's really cool. Soviet children begin to learn in the kindergarten to cooperate with others. Many of their building blocks are at the size that can only be put in place by 2 children working at once. Later games are organized around some collective form of activity. Thus, the children of railway workers in Tiflis built a regular children's railroad, half a mile long. It was a serious enterprise, run by children on their holidays. It carried passengers, collected fares, and spent them to, quote, expand the road in the regular style of the Soviet 5-year plan. There are many such children's railroads in the USSR. That's funny. Imagine having like a literal kids railroad. Like they built it, they run it, they make the profits from it, and they use those profits to expand it in the same way that, like the grown-up ones do. You love to see it. What are the ideals of these young people? If it is not sufficiently clear from their education, an article in Pravda, chief organ of the Communist Party of the USSR, makes it very plain. 5 years ago, when Hitler had made an impassioned speech to Nazi youth, demanding, quote, unquestioning obedience to the leader as the highest virtue, Pravda broke into a long editorial that denounced the Nazi ideal and declared that the Soviet ideal was the exact reverse. Not submission and blind faith, but consciousness, daring, decision, strong and original individuality, inseparably connected with the strong collective of the working people. This was set up as the Soviet ideal. To people accustomed to think of the Soviet people as, quote, regimented, the words may come as a surprise. But Stalin, in his first radio speech after the German attack, appealed to the, quote, daring initiative and intelligence that are inherent in our people. The events of the war have shown that these were no careless words. Hell yeah. One recalls the guerrilla band which, lacking rifles, stopped Nazi ammunition trucks by spiked boards placed at night in the roads and then demolished them with homemade grenades. Or the Ukrainian farmer who crept up to a German armored car, using a camouflage of 3 sheaves of wheat, then shouting, quote, "The robbers want our bread. Let's give it to them." He threw the dry wheat under the car and set it afire by tossing a flaming bottle of gasoline after it, thus converting the car into blackened iron. Or the guerrilla detachment, which captured 6 German planes, destroyed 5 of them, and sent the 6th to the Red Army, piloted by an amateur air enthusiast who was a tractor driver in ordinary life. Cool. Awesome. Great stories. You love to see them. Love that stuff. Lieutenant Talalikin's initiative is already a Soviet aviator's tradition. Exhausting his ammunition in a fight with 3 enemy planes, he rammed the tail of one enemy with his propeller, smashed the tail of another enemy plane with his wingtip, and then bailed out of his own plane safely. Moscow parks displayed the wreckage of the German planes, and other Soviet pilots quickly copied the tactics. An aviation technician, Konikov, won renown by attaching the fuselage of a plane he was repairing to the front platform of a military train whose locomotive had been bombed by the enemy. He thus pulled most necessary parts of the train to safety. Railway repairman Sigachev poured water on his clothes and walked on a board into the furnace of a locomotive, raked the burning coals aside, and replaced in 40 minutes some fire bars whose displacement would normally have halted the military train 5 hours. Interesting. These are a few of the pictures that flicker rapidly across the screen in the motion picture of the Soviet people's endless initiative. Quote, "The most valuable capital of our land is people," is a famous Stalin slogan. Yeah, this is a very different picture than what you would hear from Americans about the Soviet system. Everyone in the West seems to think that the entire Soviet system or communist system more broadly relies on just massive amounts of human capital, just like literally throwing bodies into the fire. Like that's what they think Russia does now. Like if you ask anybody about the Russia-Ukraine proxy war, Westerners all think that Russia just throws people into the meat grinder, that they just send millions of their own men to die needlessly, and that's how they somehow win wars. They really believe this stuff. Like, people really believe that Ukraine has been killing far more Russians every single day of this 3-year conflict than Russia has been of Ukrainians, and they still can't explain why Ukraine hasn't won, or why Russia isn't toppled, or why the ruble isn't rubble. Let me look at the chat real quick and see if anybody's popping off. Shibble says, this was also following some of the most extreme child labor standards from feudal Russia and Ukraine. Yeah. And our quote, farmers couldn't even fathom being an aviation specialist outside their normal thinking capabilities. Yeah. This is it's a great book. I'm really enjoying this one. Anybody in the Instagram chat popping off? No. Good morning, you guys, though. Good to see you. Let's see. I'm already at an hour. Well, let me just read this last couple of paragraphs. I remembered those words when I heard that the Red Army had blown up the great Dnieper Dam and surrounding industries worth $250 million all told. I know how the Soviet people loved that dam. I saw it 3 times during its building. I saw the workers competing on both sides of the river, putting up red stars at night to signal the progress of their work. That dam was the pride not only of its builders, but of the whole people. It symbolized Lenin's great dream of electrifying the land. It was everything that the Tennessee Valley Authority meant to our southern states. The coming of modern light, modern power, modern industry to a backward land. Millions of men and women went without meat and butter and clothes that the Dnieper Dam might be swiftly built. They said, quote, "We tighten our belts to build our future." But every Soviet citizen would blow it up swiftly rather than see it fall to Hitler and be used to enslave the Ukrainian people. The greatest thing the Dnieper Dam produced was not power, not light. The greatest thing it made was people. Out of illiterate peasant laborers, the Dnieper Dam made modern mechanics. Out of a passive folk, sunk in the farming and superstitions of the Middle Ages, the Dnieper Dam made tens of thousands of men and women of initiative, conscious of their own power. Hitler's newspaper, the Volkischer Beobachter, tried to explain the fighting temper of the Red Army by saying, quote, "The Russians fight beyond human endurance because communism has stamped all humanity out of them. It is a rather odd slant on the war." Yeah. All right, I'll bookmark it there. Because that just goes back to reaffirm what I was just saying about the stereotype that people have of Russians, of just Eastern European people in general, is that they're like these hardy, stout folk who are very strong, but they're like somehow less human. They're definitely not going to be as smart as Westerners, of course, right? It's just all stereotypes. It's all tropes. And it's basically cope. It's quite literally cope to explain why the West can't just beat Russia handily. Why Russia has been able to basically fight the entire world united against it in this proxy war, and they haven't lost. So, all right, you guys, I'm going to wrap it up here for the day. But thank you as always for joining, and I will be back again tomorrow to pick up on these same books. She will say 75-1 Ukraine to Russians currently. What do you mean, like the kill rates? Yeah, I've heard varying ratios. None of them good for Ukraine, but yeah. Let me know when Ukraine wins, you guys.